Mamy sygnał do startu.
Okay, we have a signal, so God bless you.
15 listopada.
It's 15th of November 2021,
Kwadrans po 11.
a quarter past 11.
Niniejszym
Let me hereby announce the opening of the hearing of the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry for unlawful actions taken with regard to COVID-19, and within this team I officially open the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry. Let me present the people present here with me. Professor Mirosław Piotrowski, European Parliamentary of this and hopefully future terms, Roman Fritz, Vice President of Corona, the Confederation of the Polish Crown, Secretary of our Commission, who will take the floor soon and who will be the moderator of today's hearing, and attorney Jacek Wilk, an MP of the previous one, the current and hopefully the future term in office in the Sejm of the Republic of Poland. On the left-hand side, attorneys, attorney Krzysztof Łopatowski,
pan mecenas Jarosław Litwin i pan mecenas Arkadiusz Tetela,
and Arkadiusz Tetela,
którzy będą dzisiaj zadawali pytania naszym gościom.
questions to our guests today. And our honorable guests today are Dr. Reiner Füllmich and Viviane Fischer,
Przybyli do nas,
who came to us from our western border.
ich działania mają
However, their activities are held on a global scale, and they themselves initiated the activity of the Corona Investigative Committee that during last year acquired the evidence, collected evidence of over 150 witnesses and experts in various fields. And Dr. Füllmich and Viviane Fischer
na dobry początek działania naszej komisji otwierają nam dostęp do tej dokumentacji, która została już przez nich zgromadzona.
The documentation that was
collected by them,
and as we said during the press conference 2 hours ago, we count
całą systematyczną i owocną współpracę, tak aby nasze działania zmierzały do nadania kwestii ataku narodów ze strony ich własnych rządów, nadania tej kwestii wymiaru prawnego z perspektywą ustalenia i osądzenia sprawców.
Of making perpetrator accountable for these acts. This is an ambitious goal, and for many people it seems quite unrealistic. They think that maybe that would be better not to even try to confront ourselves against this new totalitarian rule that is targeting all of us, and some of us
zdrowiu, życiu, majątności. Niektórzy z nas już są tego systemu ofiarami. Otóż niektórym zdaje się, że walka z tym systemem to wyzwanie, któremu nie da się sprostać, więc lepiej w ogóle go nie podejmować. My zaś, co ustaliliśmy już w toku krótkich, nieoficjalnych rozmów, Co do jednego jesteśmy przekonani. Stan obecny nie będzie trwał wiecznie. I rzecz w tym, żebyśmy moment otwarcia nowej koniunktury politycznej, żebyśmy mogli wykorzystać do nadania biegu prawnego tym dokumentom, które zawczasu wytworzymy. Innymi słowy, rzecz w tym, żeby odmiana naszego wspólnego losu, korzystna odmiana naszego losu, nie zastała nas nieprzygotowanych. Musimy przygotowywać się już teraz. Już teraz musimy zbierać dokumenty, świadectwa, zeznania i nadawać im zadowalający dla przyszłych sądów, zadowalający standard prawny.
Maintain a legal standard
Naszym celem
of all of them.
nie jest tutaj
It is
przede
not
wszystkim
our
ustalanie
objective
stanów medycznych,
to
naukowych.
deliberate on medical issues. We're here, we've gathered here in order to talk about legal status. We will not
dotyczące
involve in controversies related to the sphere of
którą zajmują się uczeni, badacze, lekarze.
in the sphere which is examined by medical doctors, researchers and scientists. We just want to test the legality and the legitimacy of all these actions being taken by the corporations, governments, organizations and public services all around the
Nasze
world.
posiedzenie odbywamy w Warszawie.
So we're meeting in Warsaw today. Initially, we planned to do it as in the simplest possible manner, to have it in one of numerous conference rooms that are made available in the building of the Republic of Poland. However, during the last few days, we got surprised with the decision of the Chancellery of the same Presidium, and we were prevented from using the conference room and we will refuse the access to a conference room in the building of the same one day before this parliamentary committee was about to take place. So we don't know whether there is some higher purpose in that, or maybe they did it just on purpose to prevent us from staying there. However, we had to organize this conference and this improvised place. Still, we are maintaining the formula of the parliamentary committee, so whatever will be said today, it will be registered and recorded in the system of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland, and the minutes from this meeting will be available on the website of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland under a relevant tab on the parliamentary commission of inquiry for the purpose of infringements related to unlawful actions of the government. So let's start with a spontaneous evidence being delivered by Dr. Reiner Füllmich. And Roman Fritz will be the moderator. So, ladies and gentlemen, we didn't present one important person, Mr. and MP Grzegorz Braun, the organizer who opened the meeting. In order to let you know how we're going to proceed, we will start with a half an hour introduction being delivered by Dr. Reiner Füllmich, our guest from Germany. Then the members of this committee
rozpocznie
przemował pan dr Reiner Füllmich, następnie członkowie prezydium oraz zaproszeni przedstawiciele prawicy będą zadawać pytania. Proponuję w tym momencie, żeby takich pytań zrobić 2 rundy. Będę pilnował czasu, tak żeby mniej więcej na jedno pytanie i odpowiedź było około 5 minut. Kiedy będzie się zbliżał czas dojścia do końca zagadnienia czy kwestii, będę tym symbolicznym dzwoneczkiem przypominał o tym, żeby daną kwestię starać się już zakończyć. Jeszcze raz serdecznie witam i zapraszam do wypowiedzi pan dr Reiner Füllmich. Herzlich willkommen.
Dr. Reiner Füllmich.
Thank you very much. This is a real honor. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, both of us are delighted and very happy to be here. My name is Reiner Füllmich, and today I want to give you a summary of the findings of the Berlin Corona Investigative Committee to date. I'm licensed to practice law in Germany and in California. Until COVID emerged, we exclusively represented, that is my law firm, consumers and small and medium-sized businesses against large global corporations, usually criminal global corporations, such as Deutsche Bank, which I used to work for, VW, and Kuehne + Nagel, the world's largest freight carrier. All of this changed after a virus
zanim nastąpiły zmiany związane z koronawirusem.
I'm going to slow down, yes. All of this changed after a virus previously labeled harmless was suddenly declared the cause of a global pandemic in March of 2020. And the world was suppressed with lockdowns, social distancing, and mask mandates, as well as mass PCR testing and so-called vaccinations for perfectly healthy people. No coherent explanation was ever given for this sudden change of opinion from, don't worry, this is a harmless virus, to this is a very dangerous virus, many people will die. Instead, our governments and the mainstream media deliberately spread panic. There are several leaked internal papers of the ministries of the interior in various countries that prove this targeted fear-mongering. This was done worldwide in a lockstep approach of continuously blasting out the alleged danger of the alleged new virus via the mainstream media. In order to make this horror story credible, it was emphasized with horrific images from Bergamo, Italy, and New York, among other places. This was to suggest to everyone that there was every reason to panic. Very strange, as one would expect a real government to try and keep the population calm if there was a real emergency. In the meantime, we have come to understand that, at least until the beginning of the rollout of the so-called vaccines, there was no excess mortality anywhere. The horrific images were partly staged and partly based on gross medical malpractice. In the face of this chaotic situation, which occurred literally overnight, as if on command, my friend and colleague Viviane Fischer, who is sitting right next to me, and I founded the Corona Investigative Committee in Berlin on July 10th of 2020. We did this in order to get answers to the questions to which our federal government, for reasons unknown to us at the time, was not prepared to provide any answers. Above all, we wanted to know, how dangerous is the virus really? How reliable is the PCR test developed by the German professor Drosten and recommended worldwide by the WHO for detecting infections? And how much damage are the COVID measures causing economically and to people's health? I'll summarize our findings today. Since July 10th, 2020, we have consulted with about 150 distinguished scientists and experts from all over the world and from all areas of science, including health, law, economy, psychology, and psychiatry. We consulted with them on these questions. How dangerous is the virus? How reliable is the PCR test? And and how much harm is caused by the COVID measures. Among these experts are Dr. Mike Eden, he's the former vice president of Pfizer, Professor Luc Montagnier, a Nobel Prize laureate from France, Catherine Austin Fitz, an investment banker and a former deputy minister of the United States, Dr. Robert Malone, the inventor of the mRNA vaccine technique, and recently many politicians, including Sue Frost, who is a member of the Board of Supervisors of Sacramento County in California, and very recently with Eastern European politicians from Romania and from Croatia, who gave a press conference in the European Parliament on how dangerous this situation is. Now, if somebody had told me a year and a half ago what the outcome of the Corona Committee's work to date would be, I would have told them to take their pills and see their doctor. But our hearings prove the following results beyond any reasonable doubt. One, COVID measures were never about health. We don't have a pandemic. We have a virus circulating that any intact human immune system can fight just as well as the flu. Apart from that, there are very good alternative methods of treatment to prevent or treat this disease, such as vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, possibly even ivermectin and others. Two, our governments, at least almost all European governments, as well as that of the United States, are not acting in our best interest, but are largely under the control of the backers of the global corporations and NGOs, which are summarized by Catherine Austin Fitz as Mr. Global. This is also the term that I will be using here when I refer to those who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. How did we come, as the Corona Committee, how did we come to this conclusion? Well, before COVID, each of us had their own sometimes strange encounters which made us wonder if something isn't quite right. But we couldn't really put our fingers on what it was exactly. Long before COVID came on the scene, my colleagues in my firm, we used to be 17 lawyers, and I had a very clear sense in our work time and again that something was wrong in the German courts of law. Global corporations, such as Deutsche Bank, VW, Kühne + Nagel, seemed to be above the law in the German courts. For example, Deutsche Bank, one of the most criminal organizations in the world, is regarded by politicians as systemically important, and thus de facto given special protection in the courts of law as well. The German phrase, they hang the small fry, but they let the big fish go because they're supposedly too big to fail, is true. Based on the behavior of the German judiciary in the COVID cases, it is now clear beyond any doubt to us that this is indeed the case. German judges who decide the cases before them not in line with the COVID panic agenda of the government, but on the basis of the applicable law, are not only put under pressure behind the scenes. Rather, this is now done openly with the arbitrary, brutal methods of an anti-democratic, even totalitarian regime. This is obviously done to send a message to the judiciary as a whole, so as to prevent them from applying the applicable law and thus questioning the government line. The dramatic example of a judge in Weimar and the experts he called upon for deciding a case proves this. Here's what happened. He asked three experts to provide expert opinions in response to a complaint from a mother of two that her children were suffering severe physical and psychological harm in school from being forced to wear masks, to comply with social distancing, and constantly getting PCR tested. All three experts are respected professors at German universities. On April 8, 2021, on the basis of the expert testimony, he ordered that the school and the school principal had to stop all such measures immediately. Based on the testimony testimony of the expert witnesses, he had determined that the measures were without any factual basis because the PCR test invented by the highly controversial German professor Drosten is not approved for diagnostic purposes. Not approved for diagnostic purposes, but only for scientific purposes. And contrary to claims of Professor Drosten, the PCR test can, in fact, under no circumstances tell us anything about infections. In addition, he had found that these COVID measures, the judge had found that these COVID measures caused very serious damage to the health of the children, of which the long-term consequences are incalculable. A few weeks after the decision, due to political pressure, his house, office, and car were searched, and his computer and cell phone were seized because he was accused of a crime. The accusation of bending the law is in the air, which is a crime. But the specific accusation was not that his decision was wrong on its merits. No. In fact, it still stands unchallenged on its merits. And for a very good reason. Both a court of appeal in Portugal and an administrative court in Austria had previously come to the same conclusion, that a PCR test cannot detect infections and therefore cannot be the basis for any anti-corona measures. Instead, the accusation was that as a family court judge, he did not have subject matter jurisdiction to decide the case. This is obviously ridiculous. Parallel to this, such searches and seizures were also carried out at the homes of the three expert witnesses, the professors, the lawyer who had supported the children, and a popular artist who happens to be a friend of the judge. How could it have come to this in a country that calls itself a democracy? Specifically, how is it that politics in Germany and in other countries, in gross violation of the old Roman legal principle of audiatur et altera pars, here also the other side, how could it have come that this other side was never heard? And how could it have come to the point that, with the help of the mainstream media, all dissenting opinions are framed as right-wing, Nazi? Meanwhile, Mr. Global and his political puppets are calling for a permanent lockdown. First COVID lockdowns, then climate lockdowns. And the continued use of untested alleged vaccines not just once, but regularly recurring every 6 months. In some countries, this is already a reality, for example, in Israel and in Australia. I will give you the answer below. How could it have come to this? Based on the Corona Committee's expert hearings, by first reporting the facts about the actual dangerousness of the virus and the reliability of the PCR test, and the health and economic damage caused by the measures. Then I'll explain what plans Mr. Global is openly, for each and every one of us to see, is openly pursuing, while distracting, of course, the population from these goals with the help of the COVID pandemic. And finally, I'll explain how we, the people, can regain not only our sovereignty, but also the assets that have been stolen from us by Mr. Global for decades. First, let's take a look at the COVID measures and let's see how it was never about health. The virus is no more dangerous than a flu virus. There are indications that the original virus, allegedly first detected in Wuhan, was artificially produced in the Wuhan Institute of Virology by means of so-called gain-of-function experiments. Such experiments intend to make a virus more dangerous, in particular to make it jump from animals to humans. These are, in fact, experiments for the production of bioweapons. Among others, the U.S. immunologist Dr. Fauci and the aforementioned German virologist Professor Dr. Drosten were significantly involved in such gain-of-function experiments. There are lots of things that still need to be clarified, but this much is certain. The original virus has long since ceased to exist. Rather, as with every flu virus, various variants or mutations have been documented that may spread more quickly, but are far less dangerous than the original virus. In addition, however, there are considerable doubts that the virus was ever isolated in a scientifically correct manner. Many scientists assume now that the flu virus, or influenza A or B, was merely relabeled by Mr. Global into a coronavirus pandemic. Ultimately, however, none of this matters. For the question of the severity or dangerousness of the virus is easy to answer. In the meantime, even the highly controversial WHO, which is in fact controlled by its largest donors, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and its offshoot Gavi, agrees with Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University, one of the most cited scientists in the world. The severity of the virus, with a so-called infection fatality rate of 0.14 to 0.15%, corresponds with that of the flu. There was no excess mortality anywhere before the beginning of the so-called vaccinations. As far as there were isolated increases or spikes in mortality, for example in Bergamo, Italy and New York, these are explained with massive medical malpractice. And here's why. In Bergamo, predominantly very old people with pre-existing conditions in nursing homes had died. Their immune systems had previously been weakened by flu vaccinations. And then, in order to keep the hospitals free for the panic-stricken COVID patients, who never appeared, sick people, including influenza patients were transferred to the elderly care homes. These then infected the weakened people there. In addition, the WHO had installed Reiner Füllmich into the Italian Ministry of Health, who falsified the data of the pandemic exercise plans. Their last pandemic exercise had not taken place in 2016, but in 2006, so that the medical professionals were unprepared. In the meantime, this man is not working at the Ministry of Health anymore, but the Italian Public Prosecutor's Office is investigating him. In New York, as every year during flu season, some but by no means all hospitals were overcrowded. On the hospital ship Comfort, with 1,000 beds available, no more than 20 to 40 beds were ever occupied. In New York, it also affected predominantly older people with pre-existing morbidities. Without the panic messages in the media, many people who would have stayed at home and cured themselves under the correct assumption that they were ill with a flu or flu-like illness stormed some of the hospitals and fell victim to either hospital germs or massive medical malpractice by, for example, intubation instead of receiving oxygen with oxygen masks, or with far too high dosages of hydroxychloroquine. Of course, we have to make this clear. Respiratory illnesses, including this one, which is now called COVID-19, are, like the flu, dangerous diseases. And of course, COVID-19, just like the seasonal flu, has individual, severe courses of illness and also death. Typically, however, the immune system intercepts the virus, and especially the highly toxic spike protein in the mouth and nose. That's why it's called a respiratory disease. It only becomes dangerous when the immune system is bypassed, circumvented, and the, mind you, highly toxic spike protein, but also other ingredients such as mRNA and lipids, other nanoparticles, are injected directly into the body. If you bypass this, go directly into the body, that's when it becomes dangerous. In any case, as post-mortem examinations carried out in Germany have shown in the meantime, the people who allegedly died with or from COVID before the start of the vaccinations, with few exceptions, had all passed the average human life expectancy and or suffered from other serious pre-existing diseases. Virtually none of the people who allegedly died of COVID had actually died from COVID. 96% of the people who allegedly died of COVID in New York and Bergamo, and 85% of the people in Sweden had died from completely different diseases. Let's take a look at the invention of this corona pandemic. What was behind this? Based in part on the testimony of two former WHO employees, but also on the testimony of historians and investigative journalists as well as scientists, we can now trace the following chronology. The corona pandemic has been a concretely planned pandemic by Mr. Global for at least 10 years. Previously, in 2009, an attempt by Mr. Global to turn the swine flu into a pandemic failed literally at the very last second. In particular because the German lung specialist, Dr. Wolfgang Wodak, who at the time had political power as a member of the Bundestag and the European Council, had exposed that pandemic as a mild flu. Back then, the WHO had unexpectedly, overnight, changed the definition of a pandemic, so that today any flu can be declared a pandemic. Until then, a pandemic was considered to be a worldwide disease with many several illnesses and many deaths. When they changed the definition, it was supposed to be simply a worldwide disease event. No need for severe illnesses and many deaths anymore. Due to this completely surprising and never explained change in definition, it was possible for the WHO, which is closely intertwined with the global pharmaceutical industry, to declare the swine flu a pandemic in 2009. The consequence of this was that expensive vaccines were produced and sold worldwide on the basis of contracts that have been kept secret to this day. These vaccines not only proved to be completely unnecessary, because contrary to all the horrific announcements from the pharmaceutical industries and universities close to it, the swine flu ultimately turned out to be a mild flu. Furthermore, the vaccines led to serious health problems. Around 1,300 children in Europe, especially in the Scandinavian countries, became incurably ill with narcolepsy and are now permanently disabled. Long before the current corona pandemic, dozens of patents on the coronavirus, including the spike protein, and also on the so-called vaccines, had already been registered, many years before. Even before the outbreak of the alleged corona pandemic, American scientists were explicitly advertising investments in corona vaccines to potential investors. In October of 2019, before the corona pandemic rolled out in March of 2020 with lockdown, social distancing, mask mandates, and finally the so-called vaccines, a final exercise took place in New York under the title Event 201. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security were involved, the usual suspects, I should say. Shortly thereafter, an outbreak of what is now known as COVID-19 allegedly occurred for the first time in Wuhan, China, due to an allegedly novel coronavirus. A short time later, however, the excitement died down in China and the alleged novel disease had been brought under control. No cases anymore. Mr. Global, however, used the Wuhan incidents as a springboard, so to speak, to set in motion his long-planned corona pandemic. How did that happen? Well, while all politicians and physicians worldwide, among them also the aforementioned Professor Drosten, as well as the mainstream media, were still reassuring citizens and explaining that the virus from China would, just as a mild flu wave, not be noticed by the vast majority of people. No special measures need to be taken. In particular, masks were completely unnecessary and pointless. While all of this was going on, Professor Drosten invented a PCR test with which COVID-19 infections should allegedly be detected. This was at the beginning of January of 2020, while he was telling everyone that there was nothing to worry about. Why did he invent this test if there's nothing to worry about? In two papers, the contents of which were disseminated worldwide by the WHO, he made two false claims. Deliberately false. We can prove this in a court of law. Those claims were crucial to the pandemic. The first one was that there are asymptomatic infections. That means that everyone should be afraid of every perfectly healthy person showing no symptoms because he or she could be infected with COVID-19 and be contagious. And secondly, he claimed that his PCR test, as the gold standard, could detect concrete contagious infections with COVID-19. Well, asymptomatic infections with respiratory viruses, such as influenza or corona, do not exist. As most recently proven by a study conducted with 10 million subjects in Wuhan in late 2020, and as Drosten also knew when he published this. He knew he was lying, and we can prove it. The PCR test, invented by Nobel Prize winner Kary Mullis, is neither approved nor suitable for diagnostic purposes. This is because it cannot distinguish between living and dead viral fragments, and it also tests positive for fragments of a virus left over from the immune system's fight against the flu or cold that has long since passed. It doesn't mean a thing. In particular, the test cannot determine whether a whole virus, fragments are not enough, whether a whole virus has entered cells and is replicating there. Drosten knew all this and had explicitly stated 6 years earlier in a newspaper interview concerning the MERS virus, that's another coronavirus. He explicitly said that a positive test had no meaning, but that completely healthy people would also test positive. Virtually overnight, for reasons that have not yet been fully resolved, but that suggest an involuntary early start to this pandemic, Mr. Global, through the WHO, politicians and mainstream media, suddenly changed his mind. Mr. Global put pressure on the WHO to quickly declare a public health emergency of international concern. Public health emergency of international concern. The acronym is PHEIC. It's pronounced fake. According to the rules of the WHO, such an international health emergency is the only basis on which completely new, untested drugs, in this case the so-called vaccines, can be used on humans. You need an emergency in order to use totally untested new drugs on humans. Usually, the development and approval of a new drug takes at least 8 to 10 years. At the first emergency meeting that the WHO had in February of 2020, those present could not agree to declare this fake because there were no cases. Everything had died down in China. Nevertheless, because of the allegedly highly dangerous situation, the group agreed to meet again 2 weeks later. At that second meeting, second emergency meeting, the fake, the public health emergency of international concern, was actually declared. What had changed? Nothing. However, Professor Drosten had made his PCR test available to the WHO, and with the help of this test, the cases needed for the declaration of a fake had been created. They really had been created. Today, it must be assumed that the proclamation of the fake and subsequently all COVID measures were based solely upon completely meaningless false positive test results. First of all, a PCR test per se cannot detect contagious infections under any circumstances, as I've just explained. Above all, however, Drosten had set up his test in such a way that it was guaranteed to generate false positives. This is because of the so-called cycles of amplification, which one needs to evaluate the results of the test. You take the swabs, put them into a machine, and then you have to use cycles of amplifications to amplify what you cannot really see. You go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 cycles of amplification, and in the meantime there's consensus that anything over 24 cycles is completely unscientific and therefore useless. The Frankfurt Health Department does not take test results of more than 24 cycles into consideration. And Dr. Mike Yeadon, formerly of Pfizer, has stated, in agreement with Fauci, by the way, that more than 35 cycles results in at least 97% false positives. But in the Drosten test, which served, mind you, which served as a blueprint for the vast majority of tests subsequently performed worldwide, 45 cycles were used. This was followed, always accompanied by the panic orchestra of the mainstream media and the vast majority of politicians, in quick succession by the COVID measures, such as the lockdown, which had been invented shortly before in China, social distancing, mask mandates, and finally the so-called vaccines. These alleged vaccines are in reality gene therapeutic experiments. And these experiments are performed on unsuspecting humans because there was no valid informed consent. It should be emphasized at this point that every invasive medical intervention is a bodily injury or battery unless the patient explicitly consents. And his consent, his or her consent, is invalid if he or she is not informed correctly and completely, that is, about the fact that no medical studies have been conducted, and about the numerous very serious side effects that have become known in the meantime. This concept of informed consent is the most important result of the Nuremberg medical trials of 1946. However, it was precisely these injections, designated by way of deception as vaccines, with substances that had not previously been tested in scientific studies for their safety and efficacy, that had been Mr. Global's goal right from the beginning. The subsequent steps ordered after the proclamation of the fake, remember, you need this fake in order to use untested new drugs on people. You need an international health emergency, which had been created in a fraudulent way, as I just explained. All of the other steps that led to the vaccines, the lockdowns, the social distancing, the compulsory masking, served only to make the population believe in a danger that did not exist, to unsettle and disorient them, and thus make them so compliant that they would finally consent to the so-called vaccines as the only means of obtaining protection or immunity against the disease. There is no reason for the use of these vaccines. This is because, as stated above, there is no COVID pandemic at all, only a PCR test pandemic. Apart from that, there are highly effective and completely harmless alternative preventive and curative treatments as outlined above. Even worse, the vaccines are completely ineffective, as the example of Israel shows particularly dramatically. There, 86% of the people treated in hospitals for COVID are double vaccinated. If you inject the poison directly into the body and don't give the immune system a chance to respond, that's what is dangerous. And they are extremely dangerous. Through a whistleblower, it has become known that the numbers of deaths after vaccination in the United States, in their VAERS register, Vaccine Adverse Events Register, that these numbers have been falsified. Conservative estimates now arrive at least 500,000 deaths after vaccination since the beginning of the vaccine rollouts. That is only from December of 2020 to July of 2021. In addition, there are other severe side effects such as neurological disorders, thrombosis, myocarditis, and more. For the fall, this fall, winter, and the coming spring, experts expect severe problems for those vaccinated when they encounter the so-called wild virus. That means they run into the cold, the common cold, or of the flu. Why? Because of ADE, that's a cytokine storm, or autoimmune diseases, and more severe cases of thrombosis, among others. Since these vaccines damage the immune system, not only will each subsequent booster, why do you need a booster if the vaccine is effective? Not only will each subsequent booster cause more damage, but precisely the contact with the so-called wild virus will as well. All of these massive side effects that have occurred in the meantime were known to the American CDC long before the vaccine rollout began. Worse yet, as evidenced by the now disclosed contents of both the manufacturer's documents submitted to the EMA and the manufacturer's secret contracts with nation states, the manufacturers do not know. This is what they say in these papers. We do not know if this is effective. We do not know if this is dangerous, but they demand immunity from nation states in the event that claims are made against them for vaccine injuries. And they also explicitly demand that if there are alternative methods of treatment, which do, of course, make vaccines completely unnecessary, their experimental products must still be purchased. No one in their right mind would ever sign such idiotic contracts. Now let's take a look finally at the plans of Mr. Global and the controlled politicians and how they can be prevented. Amazingly, anyone can read what Mr. Global and his puppets, such as Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, or Bill Gates, the Microsoft founder and the world's largest vaccine investor, are up to. It is all out in the open. For many years, following in his father's footsteps, who was a convinced eugenicist, Bill Gates has been talking about the need to dramatically reduce the world population. For years, he has been in the headlines again and again for using alleged vaccines in Africa and India, which in reality led to the sterilization of women and girls. Klaus Schwab goes in the same direction and spells this out, for example, in his book, The Great Reset, and demands beyond that a world government under the UN, which has in the meantime been brought under control by the World Economic Forum. This is to be achieved by creating as much worldwide chaos as possible in the form of pandemics, wars. They're working on one with Russia, including civil wars and natural disasters, so that the world population becomes convinced that its national governments are overwhelmed and only a world government can help. At the same time, Schwab calls for the shifting of all wealth to Mr. Global, so that in 2030, no one, except of course Mr. Global, will still own anything. But supposedly everyone will be happy with that. In addition, and this is a central building block in Mr. Global's strategy, cash is to be abolished and replaced by a digital currency. This will be allocated to or taken away from every person in the world, who can then also be found anywhere at any time via various tracking systems. Quite obviously, therefore, this is in particular, by the way, it's not our opinion, but the opinion of the psychologists and psychiatrists whom the Corona Committee has heard. When it comes to Mr. Global and his puppets, we are dealing with psychopaths and sociopaths. And here's another important piece of information. Through the WEF, initiated by Klaus Schwab in 1971, Mr. Global has been training his own puppets since 1992 through the Young Global Leaders Program. You may have heard of this. Angela Merkel and Bill Gates were among the first class to graduate, the class of 1992. Even a large number of current leaders, predominantly very weak personalities with, however, mostly well-trained rhetorical skills, also come from this program, including Macron in France, Kurz in Austria, Justin Trudeau in Canada, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, but also the German health minister Jens Spahn and the EU Commission head Ursula von der Leyen. She, by the way, as we have just learned from a whistleblower who is a translator with the European Union, is supposed to become the first little global government's head. The EU. They're trying to take over as the EU. Against this background, which increasingly more people are recognizing, very large legal disputes have been set in motion, or are now being set in motion, in India, in South Africa, in the United States, in Canada, and in France, among others. Their goal is to hold those who are responsible for this pandemic accountable under both civil and criminal law. This also includes that the assets that have been taken away from the world's population by Mr. Global and the global corporations and NGOs controlled by him are returned to us. In those in particular, Anglo-American law with its powerful tools of class actions, pretrial discovery, and of course, punitive damages, in the event that willful intentional infliction of damage can be shown, provides the tools for very effective justice. In Portugal, Austria, and in Germany, excellently written court decisions have stated that the completely unsuitable Drosten PCR test cannot be the basis for any COVID measures. The Berlin Corona Committee already has now extremely incriminating evidence proving that this corona pandemic never had anything to do with health. This is tyranny, really. Rather, Mr. Global's actions are aimed solely at these goals. Destruction of regional economies to make the population dependent on Mr. Global's supply chains, shifting the wealth of the world's population from the bottom to the top, to the super rich, to Mr. Global, population reduction, as well as Mr. Global gaining total control over the remaining population. Installation of a world government under the UN, which is now under control of the WEF. We are dealing, this must be stressed once again, with megalomaniac psychopaths and sociopaths who must be stopped and who in fact should have been stopped a very long time ago. But now the time has come. More and more people worldwide are waking up and realizing who is pursuing which goals with this pandemic. Even if the mainstream media are trying to hide this, hundreds of thousands of people are taking to the streets all over the world, including in London, England, Berlin, Germany, but also in Australia, Brazil, etc. More and more politicians and lawyers, medical doctors, as well as public service employees, even police officers, refuse to participate in these crimes against humanity. But in addition to our legal efforts and our efforts to disclose the facts and bring everything out into the open, there is a third level, namely the spiritual or religious or cosmic, call it what you will, level. And this level may turn out to be crucial, I believe. We can see this in a story a German doctor recently told us at the Corona Committee hearing. He wanted to withdraw money at an ATM and went into the lobby of a bank. There stood an elderly woman wearing a mask. No one else was in there, just him and this elderly woman, who fearfully backed away from him because he was not wearing a mask. She said he had to wear a mask because otherwise she was afraid of infecting herself and then her husband. The doctor told her, "No, you don't have to be afraid." And then he went up to her, took off her mask, and hugged her. The woman began to cry and said that no one had held her for more than a year. That's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. Humanity versus inhumanity, tyranny. We are human. We can laugh, cry, sing, dance, and hug. The other side, Mr. Global and his puppets, cannot do this. They can only fake feelings and have no empathy whatsoever. This is because the other side has no access to the spiritual or cosmic side. Let me end with this. The U.S. Constitution starts with the words, "We the people." And when the wall between East and West Berlin came crashing down 33 years ago, it was the East German peoples chanting, "We are the people," that brought it down. Mr. Global's house of cards will come crashing down the very same way. Without any doubt in my mind, Mr. Global and his puppets will lose this war of good against evil. They will lose their insane war against life and creation. There is no other way. Thank you.
Serdecznie dziękuję za wspaniałe, obszerne wystąpienie, panie doktorze. Chciałem skorzystać z okazji.
Let me use this opportunity that on your right-hand side you have Viviane Fischer, attorney at law. Do you have anything to add, or maybe we will continue with the Q&A session? Do you have any comment on what has been said by Dr. Reiner Füllmich a minute ago? Tak, nadal
evolving, and we are getting also more and more insights into the manipulation that was done to the people, and that's actually happening all around the world. It's the same structure that's used around the world in order to lure people into getting the so-called vaccination and playing along with the whole process. And it seems to be that it's some sort of almost taking the people hostage in basically like a Stockholm syndrome, that people experience some sort of cognitive dissonance, that they just cannot accept, that the government that they trust, or like used to trust at least to some extent, that it's not having their best in mind. And it's for us, it's hard to distinguish if how involved the politicians are really into the whole thing, if they are maybe also part of the cognitive dissonance themselves in some areas. Also, the judges that do not, function very well in Germany at the moment, like with regards to really speaking right. Or like to really applying the law as they should have done or used to do. Now it seems to be they seem to have some sort of legal blackout when it comes to the corona problem. It's very strange. But that needs to be really investigated also in order to help people overcome this problem. We can see that more and more people waking up. Like in the last session, we had a lady from America. She pointed out this sort of abusive relationship that people find themselves now with regard to the governments, and that she thinks that there needs to be some sort of emotional blow, some sort of emotional understanding that what's happening is not right. But what we can see with the more and more damages are coming up, more and more problems are coming up. People feel that it was a fraudulent statement of the government to tell them that you just get to have those, you need to get those 2 shots and then everything will be good again, you will be free again. They see it's a lie. It's not happening, although, they claim the vaccine is working. It's not working, and they're admitting to that, but they're still pushing more and more restrictions onto the people, and people feel the discrepancies, and that's waking a lot of people up. So we see there's a lot of movement right now, and we found that, we have had information from a very important psychology professor from Belgium, Professor Desmet, and he pointed out that in this kind of sort of totalitarian, seductive, it's a mixture between seduction and pressure applied at the same time, this social engineering, manipulative thing that's going on. Maybe 30% get what's going on. Really, they understand it. That's us, I guess. Also, and then you have maybe like 30% who are really stuck and just cannot see what's going on. They have this extreme form of cognitive dissonance and just cannot overcome it. But then there's this huge crowd of 40% that is on the fence, that's seeing the problems, and when it's in the moment that it's becoming more and more obvious, they are able to get off the fence and to also take measures and to speak out. We from the Corona Committee in Berlin, we get so many informations behind the scenes from people, from whistleblowers and people who are in important positions, and they say, I would love to come out, but I just cannot do because I have a family to take care of, I have a house to pay, I'm afraid I'm going to go bankrupt, so I just can provide you with information behind the scenes. But it's a lot of people. And we are very excited to be here today because we think it's so important that the people join forces all around the globe. And it's great that we are able to connect to our neighbors, especially from the eastern side, because we think that for the Polish people and other people from the former Eastern Bloc, the experience of a totalitarian system is so much more still awake. We have this also with people in the former eastern part of Germany. and so much more awake, and they see that there's something really going in the absolute wrong direction, and I think there's more energy also, or like a great energy also to really to just say no, I'm not doing this, I do not consent, and maybe at the moment sometimes not so open, but just don't play along, just don't wear the mask. And in Germany we are a little bit more authoritarian driven. A lot of people just, play along and take on the mask and sometimes even go after others to do this. But we see from sort of an intellectual point of view and an investigative point of view, I think we've really done great work. And really brought all these things to light. And I think it's very important, and we're excited that we're here today, and that there's an initiative from the Polish people to really go this way and to join forces visibly. I would like to close with a personal story, from my mother's side, my great uncle, he was a Catholic priest, and during Nazi time, he saw that the evil that was done by this German, the Nazi project of killing all the disabled, and the life unworth living. This big program that they started, and he spoke out against it, in church, and he was after after one preaching that he did, was taken away by the Gestapo and put into the concentration camp and died there. And so this was very, this story has it's very prevalent, obviously, in my family. And it's an important warning, I think, that we should take with us, that we can see what happened in the past and that we just cannot go this path any further, into like a health dictatorship where it's going, where we already see this, that the unvaccinated are being attacked as being, being inferior and being excluded from their human rights. And I think that's very important that we all see this and really as a human family all around the world say no to what's going on, and really just what Reiner Füllmich said, we are the people and we are the humans, and we're going to fight for our human way of living to continue, and I think I'm also convinced we will win.
Thank you very much, Attorney Vivian Fischer. And now we pass to the round of questions and answers. So I propose to start with Attorney Jacek Wilk. Please ask your questions. Thank you, President. Doctor, I agree with you fully. The actual circumstances of this problem and their consequences stem from the PCR tests, because PCR tests are not fully reliable, but they served the purpose of intimidating, of building the fear-mongering and so on. And also PCR tests became the foundation of measures introduced by the governments. However, from the point of view of the law, the central problem feels to be the proportionality of the measures. The situation is like this. On the basis of the fear-mongering, of the escalating feeling of threat based on false, unreliable PCR tests, the governments have convinced their societies to use unproportional measures and also legal measures, unproportional for this situation. This is the situation in Poland, among others. In March 2020, Polish Parliament, what they did was to do some kind of state of emergency, which was not an actual state of emergency, because we do have a definition of state of emergency for natural disasters or wars, and this is defined in our constitution, and it defines precisely the state of emergency and what can be done. However, the government, Polish government, did not use any of the existing possibilities defined by the constitution for this kind of difficult situations, or even emergencies or natural disasters, which can be used for infectious disease as well. But they preferred to do something else, to not use the existing one, but to introduce some kind of state of emergency that was not defined in the constitution, that they created themselves. And this is our Polish reality right now. We are living in a reality where our rights, our civic rights, are being limited, just like there was a state of emergency. However, no state of emergency was ever officially proclaimed, and nobody knows when it will end. When you have a normal, let's say, state of emergency that is defined by the constitution, you have to say how long it will last. But in this case, we don't know. It may last for 2 years, 3 years, or 10 years. So finally, I get to my question. So I think this is the point of departure for all the legal problems. Like, this is the point of departure of the entire problem and of sliding towards totalitarianism. I would like to ask Dr. Judging by your experience from Germany and from other countries, would you say that the governments actually violate their own constitutions because they do not use the measures defined in the constitution for an emergency state? Instead, they orchestrate some new state of emergency that was not defined in the constitution. They limit our rights and freedoms in an unproportional manner to the threat, and thusly they violate our constitutional rights. So I would like to show you an example of how unproportional those measures are. Due to coronavirus and other comorbidities, we had 70,000 plus deaths. However, the measures, pandemic measures, caused the deaths of 150,000 because the government limited their access to medical aid, to healthcare, with replacing doctor visits by telemedicine, and this causes deterioration of the health of the citizens. So do we really need measures to fight a threat that bring us more problems than profits? Because consequences of the lockdown and other measures to fight the pandemic brought more deaths than the pandemic itself. So can you comment on this? Can you see also that governments violate their constitutions and limit our freedoms and rights in an unconstitutional way, and also cause more deaths than the pandemic itself?
Yes.
Dr. Füellmich, please answer.
The answer is short. Yes. Our governments, or the governments which we think are our governments, somebody else is pulling their strings. This is very obvious to me. They all violated our constitutional rights. I prefer to attack in our legal proceedings, to attack the very foundation of everything. That's why I'm saying we need to kick out the legs from under them, and that's the PCR test. But of course, there are many different ways of attack. You can also say, I don't care about the foundation, I'm just going to look at how dangerous is the virus really. And if it is no more dangerous than the common flu, which everyone seems to agree on, it has a 99.97% survival rate. It is dangerous for the elderly and for those who have comorbidities, but it has a 99.7% survival rate. It is non-existent for the children. Statistically speaking, they are not at risk. They're only at risk if you expose them to the vaccinations, because that's what kills them. But if you can look at it from a perspective of proportionality, and if you take this into account, it's no more dangerous than the common flu, then this is totally, completely out of proportion. Because we've never had mask mandates, we never had vaccine mandates, which is what we have now, effectively speaking. Why do we have it now, without there being anything that's more dangerous than the common flu? There are many, by the way, there are many decisions. This is an emergency that is totally, completely made up. It doesn't exist. That's why I prefer to attack at the foundation, because if there is nothing except for the PCR test positive results, then there is no foundation for anything. But I know of many decisions in the American courts of law, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, and I think of Ohio, and also one of the courts in California. They all decided that, yes, it's okay for the governor to have a state of emergency if something really dangerous and totally unheard of arises all of a sudden, but not forever. You can do it for a month maybe, but then you finally have to come to your senses and take a closer look. That's why all of these decisions state, no, you cannot do this. It is totally out of proportion. And I think it's particularly obvious in the United States, where you have these many different states. There's some states that do not comply at all. If you look at, for example, South Dakota and North Dakota. In South Dakota, they have a Republican governor. She refused to have any of these measures, any of these anti-corona measures. And right next to her state is North Dakota. And they had a hard lockdown, they had mask mandates, etc. But there's no difference. It didn't help anyone. That's why these measures are totally unproportional. And all of this is illegal, all of this is unconstitutional. We're not talking about health, we're not talking about justice, we're talking about tyranny by psychopaths.
Could you please repeat in capital letters, this is all illegal?
It is completely illegal. There is no basis, neither a factual basis nor is there a legal basis. If there's no factual basis, there cannot be a legal basis.
Could I add one thing? In Germany, we even have the bizarre situation now that they declared that the pandemic situation is basically, it's run out. You know, it's not, because it was limited. And now they're looking to prolong the measures even without officially the pandemic being still alive. So, I mean, there you can see that it is a political thing. It's not a health-driven thing. And what you can also see is that you know, I spoke to a person from the Ministry of the Interior, who's like a population protection person, you know, in charge of like evaluating risks and maybe you know, putting in place countermeasures. And I asked him, so now you are bringing out this mass vaccination program, and what kind of measures do you have in place in order to protect the population if this goes wrong? I mean, do you have already like hospitals set up and stuff? And then this person just said, no, we just hope it all goes right. So this cannot be, and you can see that they're not taking, not looking, you know, really they're forcefully basically not looking at the collateral damage. They're not doing like enough autopsies. I hear that in Poland, I think you've only had like one or very few autopsies. In Germany, like a doctor, a professor, you know, looked at, did a lot of autopsies at some point, like I think it was very early on, and found that I think it was like 80% of the deceased that he looked at did actually not die of corona. And in the meantime, we have gone further into that direction. The Corona Committee, we have financed quite a few autopsies, and we've presented the results in a pathology conference that can be visited online. We can also have a Polish translation, if that is if that's of help for you, and. That's clearly shown that of the vaccination victims, so that was the corona side that this professor did like in March last year, or like May or something. But now we're also looking at the victims from the vaccination, and there you can see that like in 10 diseases that these professors investigated, you know, like looked at, that 7 are really very likely connected. The death is connected to having been vaccinated because of thrombosis and all that. And a government, that would be, taking care of its citizens would really need to investigate all these things and then, do a balanced decision between what's good for the people, how dangerous the measures can be that they, that they take compared to the dangerousness of the virus. And we see it's absolutely out of proportion, and it's really like turning a blind eye onto the consequences.
Attorney Jacek Wilk would like to add something. I would like to say that the situation in Poland is quite strange, because if you test positive for coronavirus, you do not receive any treatment. You have to stay at home and wait and see what happens. If you have bad luck, the illness develops, you go to the hospital and you get the mechanical ventilation. And if someone wants to treat them, they are ridiculized for using some alternative medical treatment. And at the same time, we have an experiment with new preparations, vaccines, and nobody sees that there is a problem. Yeah, that's right. This is a very complex medical topic. But now let me come back to legal aspect of the topic, of this political aspect. So it's not only about our health. The objectives of politicians are quite different. So let me ask now Mirosław Piotrowski to ask his question. Thank you very much, Chairman. Our guest, Dr. Reiner Füllmich, has mentioned a person who he calls Mr. Global, megalomaniac, psychopath, sociopath. But you also talked about marionettes, but you didn't mention any Polish surnames. So is it out of you just want to be nice with us, or haven't you noticed any marionettes in Poland? Maybe these are not marionettes of Mr. Global, maybe they are marionettes of other marionettes. And now another question in relation to what Attorney Wilk has said. I would like to talk about the legal framework in Poland and the local level. So have you seen similar cases in Germany and in other countries? So the C19 group that associates legal attorneys and also medical doctors, we have prepared an inquiry for our Minister of Health and send it to the minister to ask about the PCR test. We formulated 11 questions for the minister. Firstly, to tell us the list of manufacturers of those tests, and also we asked them about the cycles of amplification. The Ministry of Health received 11 questions from us, and they couldn't answer a single one of them. They passed it to the National Institute of Health of the National Institute of Hygiene, who tests medications and is dependent on the Ministry of Health, and they only could answer 10 questions, but they said, I don't know, I don't know, I don't understand. That was the answer. So this is the situation right now related to PCR tests. So do you see the same situation in Germany and in other countries in the world? And lastly, I'm not sure if you know that the Minister of Health in Poland does not have to be a doctor of medicine, and it's not. It's an economist, or the deputy is a historian, but they make decisions. And also the General Sanitary Inspector has billion zlotys of budget and 20,000 employees. It's been a year since we wrote the Prime Minister asking why the General sanitary inspector is not there because the post has been vacant for the entire year of the pandemic. The Minister of Health has the obligation to assign a general sanitary inspector, and it has to be a doctor of medicine. However, the chief sanitary inspector post has been vacant for over a year, and we asked them when it will be appointed. They said they wouldn't appoint anyone at all. So we sued them, actually. It's in the fiscal office already. So the decision was that the Minister of Health is not liable in front of Polish courts. However, we did have another decision that every Polish minister is accountable in Polish courts. Other ministers told me that yes, they are eligible, they are liable and accountable, they can be sued and they can go to court. However, in the legal state currently in Poland, the Minister of Health illegally is not liable, cannot be sued, cannot be sued to court due to negligence and so on and so forth. Other politicians can do this, can be sued, and the Minister of Health cannot, which is a strange situation in Poland and in Warsaw. So these are two questions from me. Thank you.
So, Professor, please respond to this issue, which was quite comprehensive.
Well, I didn't mean to be nice. I just don't know the intricacies of Polish politics. I'm pretty sure that you have a lot of puppets here as well, because they have them everywhere, all over the world. It's those that were installed by Mr. Global. Mr. Global is just a word for a group of very rich people and very crazy people who have been working on this for at least 10 years, probably 30 years or so. And I just don't know the names of those who are doing or acting at their bidding. But I'm pretty sure that your Secretary of Health is one of these puppets. Ours is, because he is not a doctor, just like yours isn't. He's a banker, but he doesn't even know anything about numbers. He is stupid. As far as the immunity from legal persecution is concerned, yes, I know that many people claim that they are immune from a legal persecution. That is not true when it comes to intentional harm. And that is what we're talking about here. This is not an accident. This is not negligence. This is intent. We can show this. We know that those who are pulling the strings, of course, they're acting intentionally. The puppets this is what we learned from one of the professors of psychology. I think that was just this past Friday. This was new to us. Many of these puppets act in the way that they act because they have either been bribed or they're being pressured. There's extortion going on. The worst problem that all of these puppets have is that they are mediocre. They don't have any special talent. Some of them appear to have rhetorical training, but that's it. If you look at their biographies, for example, Professor Dr. Drosten, the guy who invented the PCR test, which then supposedly is the gold standard for the detection of infection all over the world, because what he says is being amplified through the WHO. If you look at him, he is not a real professor. This guy, in Germany, if you want to be a professor of law or of economics or medicine, you have to write what is called a habilitation thesis. I think that the same is true here in this country. He hasn't. He was given his professorship by one of the richest families in Germany, the Quandt family. They are the ones who own, among other things, BMW. Two scientists decided to take a closer look at this person. Well, if he hasn't written a habilitation thesis, if he got his professorship as a gift from a rich family. What about his doctoral dissertation? Because he calls himself a doctor of medicine. They took a closer look, and it turns out what he supposedly wrote as a doctoral dissertation in 2003, and which should have been listed with the National Library in 2003, was not listed. The first time it appeared was when they took a closer look in June of 2020. And there's so many weird things about, there's these two scientists that were looking into this, and they got completely independent of each other. They didn't know of each other. And when they finally met, they realized that they were both being lied to by the University of Frankfurt, where this guy supposedly wrote his doctoral dissertation. There are very, very serious doubts about his academic qualifications. And I think this is true for most of these puppets, if not all of these puppets. It makes it easy for those who are pulling their strings to keep them under control for two reasons. Because they're weak, and the other reason is that they're afraid. Because if finally the light is shone on what they're really doing, then they're going to lose everything. This is just like in the movie The Wizard of Oz. You pull away the curtain and there he sits. It's not a giant, no, it's a little dwarf. Meaningless, totally meaningless. That's what I think is one of the major problems that they have with these people, because it's, on the one hand, it's easy to control puppets like these, but on the other hand, they're deadly afraid of losing everything.
Dziękuję bardzo za wypowiedź, za komentarz, panie doktorze.
And your comment, Doctor. Let me now invite our guests, our attorneys at law, to ask their questions. Let's start with Krzysztof Łopatowski. You can start. At the beginning, let me thank you for this interesting take, and a lot of interesting topics were explained from that, and I wanted to ask for them. While listening to the discussion and to the questions asked by my four speakers, there is one problem, and it boils down to one simple thing, to money and to dependency and to the corruption. So in this context, let me ask you a question which has already been mentioned during your presentation with regard to this Romanian European parliamentary voluntaries. Do we know, or maybe do you have any hints or orientation what can be the content of this secret agreements made by the European Union and big pharma corporations? Do we have any, could you shed some light at this issue, or to allow us to get access to any knowledge? Thank you very much. My comment here, I don't know if you remember the presentation of this Romanian parliamentary who presented an agreement with pharmaceutical companies, and 90% of this agreement was blacked out and hidden. So please respond, dear doctor.
It is true that what this Romanian member of the European Parliament presented was a totally redacted, ridiculously redacted contract. You couldn't read anything. Most of it was black. But through whistleblowers, we know what is really in these contracts. And that's what I summarized. What is in these contracts is, one, they cannot tell, the producers cannot tell if these vaccines are effective. They don't want to be nailed down. Two, they don't know if they're dangerous. Again, they don't want to be nailed down. And three, if something goes wrong and somebody sues them, they want the nation states or the European Union to hold them, to give them immunity. And four, even if there are alternative methods of treatment, it doesn't help the nation state because they're still bound by the contract. They still have to buy what they don't need because there are alternative methods of treatment. That is what they're trying to keep secret. A friend of ours, who's also an attorney, dug even deeper. And he found, we're going to have to, this is not for publication yet, but it looks as though these contracts have not been signed by anyone, because no one wants to be nailed by these contracts. And that's why we believe many politicians kind of duck down and don't answer questions, because that's one of the things that you mentioned, Professor Piotrowski. They don't answer questions. We have a very well-known journalist in our country. His name is Boris Reitschuster. He spent a lot of time in Russia. He was a correspondent for one of the major news magazines in Germany. And he kept telling everyone how well, not really democratic that system in Russia is. He is now about to move back to Germany, to Russia, because he says it's much more democratic there than it is in Germany. His questions were never answered. He asked the politicians, there's an official press conference, which they have, I think, once a week or so, and he asked them questions about the PCR tests and other things. He didn't ever receive an answer, because these people don't want to give you an answer. They don't want to sign anything. They don't want to give you an answer, because if they do give you an answer, then it turns out they're lying, then they're in really, really bad shape, because they are not immune from legal prosecution for lying. If you do something, if you cause harm intentionally, then that's it. There is no immunity. I don't think anywhere in the world, and no legal system.
I would like to add a little bit, if I may, to the financial interests, that we can see. We see, like, for instance, Professor Drosten, who's like at the core of this PCR test and who has handed in a paper to the WHO, like in the beginning. And, in this paper, there was also a company involved from Germany, Tipmol-Biol, which in the meantime has been bought by Roche. And Roche actually always did the sales for them, also with regards to this PCR test. And it's very interesting, we looked at it more closely, and it is the case that Drosten and these people from Tipmol-Biol basically came out with always the first PCR test for any virus crisis or pseudo-virus crisis like Zika, MERS, SARS, bird flu, swine flu, whatever, you name it, in the past years. And there seems to be some very close, they always came out at first, in the beginning, push it onto the market, like you taking advantage of a first mover advantage, pushing it out into the market, and then obviously this company made a lot of money, but we do not know. Maybe there's a kickback constellation also for Drosten, because it's kind of strange that he would always, put all his knowledge into this development, but then not profit. And also they never applied for any patents, which is also kind of strange, but because the patents which actually belong to his employer, like the Charité, and we've, asked a series of questions to the Charité, and they said, well, in this health emergency thing, there's no patents. We never looked at patents even. And that's very incredulous, that's not very credible that they would actually go for that. And they're also a public entity and can therefore not just give away patents or like the option to have a patent just like this, because they're bound by public obligations. So it seems that there's also a network of really, very attractive financial interests that may be involved, and that might drive these things to a major extent, and we should look more closely into that. And also that might be the case here as well in Poland.
I have one thing to add to this. We don't think that this is about money. We think that the people who are behind this, who are pulling the strings, they have more than enough money to ever spend. They're afraid that we're finding out about them. They're in a panic, really. That's what we think. They are using money. They don't need it. They have it. They use it in order to bribe people. That's why they bribe the journalists, they bribe the politicians, they bribe the doctors, and even the lawyers. That's why they're paying 200 euros an hour to doctors who participate in these vaccinations. That's a lot of money. It's bribe money, really. It's really bribe money because that's how they make doctors look the other way. They're only seeing the money that they can make, and they don't care about what happens to their patients. But it's not about money. Money is being used to bribe people.
Dziękuję za odpowiedzi.
Very much for your answers. We're learning astonishing things, staggering things in fact. So that makes our proceedings as the parliamentary committee really valuable, and that makes that gives sense to our work. So now Jarosław Litwin and his questions. Dr. Reiner.
The question is, what was and is the role of medical councils in Germany and in other countries in bringing about the system of lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations and COVID passports? And did these councils express any kind of dissent regarding these procedures? Thank you.
It's a very shameful role that the doctors of medicine played in this, and all of the medical institutions played. It's a very shameful role in that they mirrored what happened 80 years ago. 80 years ago, it was the medical profession which was instrumental in carrying out all these cruel, evil experiments. That was why they were held responsible, accountable afterwards in those medical trials, the medical Nuremberg trials, which we think is the most important outcome of the Nuremberg trials. If you look at the main war criminals, they didn't even get them. They got a few, but they didn't really play a big role. But the most important outcome is the doctors, because it was supposedly, it was to make sure that this will never ever happen again, that no medical experiments were ever again performed on unsuspecting human beings. That's where the concept of informed consent is from. And all of a sudden, we're seeing the same thing happening over again. And again, it's not just me saying this, but it is one of the experts who we listen to. Her name is Vera Sharaf. She's a Holocaust survivor. And she said, she's now in her early 90s, and she said, I would never have believed that I will have to fight the same system, the same people again that I fought back 80 years ago. But she says, again, it is the medical profession who is culpable. They're the ones without whose help this would never have happened. This would never have been successful rather. And so the short answer is they're, again, criminals.
But Reiner, just to add, there is resistance also from the doctor side, but not on the official side. You know, we have a lot of people like Dr. Wodak, who was able to stop the swine flu swindle in 2009, and we have Professor Suharit Bhakti. We have a lot of people who've come out. But the thing is, whenever they speak out and provide a lot of evidence, provide the studies. Professor Walla, for instance, has conducted a mask study, how dangerous that is for the children, and it got published in a very good journal. And shortly after that, you know, like the editors of that board threatened to withdraw from the board, apparently because they're financed by some pharma interest, and so
all of them financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
All of them, yeah. And so, you know, now he's putting that is probably going to be published in another magazine. But, you know, you see that once these people come out with the information, with studies and all that, they're immediately harassed, they're crazy, they're too old, they're whatever, you know, it's very intense. You know, the amount of pressure they get from even their employers, you know, at the universities they get pressure. Some of them got fired. from famous institutes like one virologist or immunologist who came out and then he lost his job, and it's very intense, the amount of pressure that's exerted on them.
Dziękujemy serdecznie za.
Thank you very much for providing us with the answers to this question. And now let me leave the floor to Arkadiusz Tetela. Auschwitz didn't come from nowhere. This is famous quote from one Auschwitz prisoner who said it during the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Marian Turski appealed not to stay indifferent. That if we are indifferent, we get accustomed to stigmatization. That we shouldn't remain indifferent against any other and when dealing with any group for any reason if a group is under discrimination. So I'd like to thank you that you're not staying indifferent, that you take actions and that these are concrete actions. I know about the litigation instigated in 2021 against the Supreme Court in Canada. And I'd like to use this opportunity. Did you manage to conclude this litigation by court? I mean this lawsuit with regard to a crime against humanity. Do you plan to take any legal actions on international scale with regard to Europe? I mean, did you consider to file a lawsuit against the International Court, Justice Court in The Hague? I know that this international tribunal is for settling disputes between states. It uses its alleged competence. And the matter that can be examined, they can examine any matter which is in breach to international law. We're aware that one basis of the functioning of the European Union up to now, it was the free flow of people. And now it becomes a thing of the past, because one pillar of functioning of the European Union now stopped being up to date. It got obsolete. And all that despite the fact that on the 27th of January this year, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted directive preventing from discrimination of unvaccinated people against COVID-19 for any reason, also due to their beliefs. If it's so, if the free flow of people in the European Union is not possible without the COVID certificates in some countries, we cannot eat out without such a certificate. For example, in Greece, because it's not about having a negative PCR test. It's about confirmation of vaccination. And it's similar in Austria, for example. So it's something we can observe now. Why, taking into account that Sweden didn't follow such policy, Denmark lifted restrictions on the 28th of September, why maybe it's a good idea to go to the Hague Tribunal and say this is not the European Union that we agreed for. This is a violation of our rights. This is one question. And another question is,
do you know what is the role of the Koch Institute in Germany in the creation of anti-pandemic policies? And have you looked into the financing of that institution? I would also like to ask if about the important fundamental matter of the PCR tests and the false positives, have you ever considered taking action against doctors? Because this is also, and to look into how doctors are being censored, because the specialists, the experts should be free to speak openly, to give us some different point of view, different from the one we see on the media. So in Germany, are doctors able to speak freely or not? And have you undertaken any actions in that respect? Because the Polish doctors want to have a new self-governance authorities to be able to speak freely about the truth. The time is up. You will have a second round of questions. So, yes, I have plenty of them. Let us respond, at least, for the part that you have already asked. Doctor?
Yeah, I'll start with the class action in Canada. That is our friend Michael Swinwood, who filed a class action which is going to become an international class action. A class action is when you have one person who acts as a representative of many, many more people who have suffered harm in the same way through the same activity. I once represented a German woman who suffered harm from breast implants, American-made breast implants. It turned out that all of them were leaky. They caused serious health problems. And when the judge in Michigan realized that this is not just one case, not just two cases, but more than 250,000 cases, he decided he would allow this case to go forward as a class action, meaning he informed everyone worldwide through the mainstream media of the fact that there is a legal dispute against the maker of these defective breast implants. Worldwide, anyone was able to learn about this, to find out about it. And then they could decide whether or not they would join this class or have their own legal dispute. The client who turned to me for help asked me to have her join the class so that she wouldn't have to spend any money, but there's only this one representative plaintiff. If that representative plaintiff wins, the whole group class wins. If he loses, they all lose. So she joined in that class, and she ultimately got paid damages for this. And that is precisely what this class action, which has been filed in Canada, is made for. Our friend Michael Swinwood has been representing mostly indigenous people in Canada, and in the United States, and in South America. For 25 years, this is what he has been doing. And he says they have always been the subject of, well, persecution. They have always, the other side has always tried to kill them, the indigenous people. And he says the big difference between what happened to them over the last 300 years and what is happening now, that all of a sudden we are all Indians. We're all being persecuted. So that class action was, without any hearing, was lost. The judge dismissed the case. and then Michael Swinburne wrote an appellate brief. Now it is before the higher court in Canada. The real hearing will happen in March of 2022. A bunch of other cases have been filed as class actions in the United States. We're thinking about helping our colleagues with one of them for the Los Angeles Police Department, because they are also under a lot of pressure right now. And you have to keep in mind, if we win one of these cases, everyone wins, because the facts of these cases are all the same. It is always the PCR test. There's never a legal basis for this. And if there's no legal basis, then just like you found out in this country. You told me about it. No, you didn't. You told me about it last night. When there's no legal basis for it, it's all illegal. Your group has won over 200 cases, right? So that is what's happening. That is what's happening in the U.S. and in Canada right now. As far as other international cases are concerned, our friend and colleague, Dr. Renate Holzeisen, she's an Italian attorney. She filed 4 nullification complaints against the EU because the EU admitted authorized the 4 vaccines, BioNTech, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson, and another one. And she just lost this case because the EU, on formal grounds, of course, they don't want to look into the merits of the case because they know they can't win this. But she lost it on very formal grounds because the court said, no, your clients, doctors and members of the healthcare business in Italy, your clients have no standing. They cannot sue the European Union because the EU approved or gave it conditional approval to the vaccines. It has no direct effects on your clients. It isn't our approval of the vaccines. It is your country's employers making vaccinations mandatory, or else they're going to lose their jobs. This is idiotic. It's hair splitting. It makes no sense. On an international scale, yes, The Hague is, of course, a very important court. It's the International Criminal Court. We are in close cooperation with 2 so-called human rights defenders, and they've been working on a case for at least 10 months now, probably a little longer, maybe over a year. They're trying to put together the evidence to bring before the court, the International Criminal Court. We know that other lawsuits have been filed, criminal complaints have been filed with The Hague, for example, by Israel. However, Israel is not a signatory of the contracts for the International Criminal Court, so they're going to have problems. But this new case, well, the case that has been going on, or that they've been working on for at least a year, probably a little longer, that we think has a good chance of winning. We do have to take into consideration, however, that in these international courts, The Hague, the Human Rights Court, and another one that I can't think of right now, at least 25% of the judges were appointed with money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or George Soros. So you have to be really careful. I think ultimately we will have to set up our own judicial system with our own lawyers, with our own judges and prosecutors. For example, in Germany, you can forget about the prosecutors. They're not independent. Even the European Court has stated that German prosecutors, German district attorneys cannot issue arrest warrants, international arrest warrants. Why? Because they're not independent. Because there's always the question hovering over everything. Is this a politically motivated arrest warrant? Is Angela Merkel trying to pick one of her enemies and throw them into jail? It is an open secret, at least in the European Union, that we don't have a functioning system in Germany, that is, of prosecutors. It doesn't work. But we are going after doctors, You asked about the German Robert Koch Institute, which we think is making not just mistakes, but intentionally misleading the public. It is run by someone who is a veterinarian. He's another one of these mediocre people with a very shady background. He is very important. The man who runs our Robert Koch Institute, his name is Wieler, Professor Lothar Wieler. He's very important because he has a highly important position within the WHO. He is the one who evaluates whether or not the current measures are enough or if we need more stricter measures. And if he says we need more and stricter measures worldwide, then the WHO is going to find that. So he is a dangerous man. I have filed a couple of complaints against him for damages for my clients. I have filed one complaint against Drosten because he's the one who is instrumental in lying to the people with respect to the PCR test and asymptomatic infections. We tried to, Viviane and I went to the hearing which was supposed to be held last week on Tuesday. A group of 40 spectators wanted to come in and join us and see what's going on because this is a public court. We were held up right before the court building by someone who was actually a nice person, and he told us, well, there's a few too many. We don't have enough room for all of you to fit into the courtroom. Also, if you're not going to wear a mask, we're going to need you to show us your exemption, your medical exemption. Well, we did that. Then we went up to the courtroom. We had to wait in front of the courtroom. There were 3 security guards there, as though they're expecting us to have flamethrowers or start a revolution or something. And then the court appeared, the 3 judges. It's a 3-panel judge court. And they were all masked. How can you be an independent judge in a case that goes at the core of what this is about, goes for the foundations of this? How can you be an independent judge if we are in a case in which we're suing the man who invented these lies, which are the foundations for the mask mandates? If you as a judge approach your courtroom masked, doesn't this show that you're on the side of the other side? You're not impartial. You're not independent. But to make matters even worse, then he allowed 7 of the spectators to go in and watch what's going on. And then we came in, Viviane and myself. I have a medical exemption. And then he told me, no, you cannot argue this case here unless you wear a mask. I said, I have a medical exemption. I'm not going to let you tell me to injure myself. I could have lung cancer, I could have asthma. I'm not going to tell you what I have, but I have a medical exemption, and it's not your place to ask me about the details. He said, no, we don't accept this. We don't accept this. I am the king in this courtroom. So I had to leave. My client was without legal representation. Now, unlike here in Poland, if this is a case before the Landgericht, which is one of the district courts, you cannot argue your case in person. As a plaintiff, you need, and also as a defendant, you need a lawyer to represent you. So what this guy did is he kicked me out of the court. I couldn't represent my client. Then we know this because of the spectators who told us what happened after we left. Then he told the opposing counsel, they were all wearing masks, of course, why don't you move for a default judgment? That's what they did. They moved for a default judgment, and he entered the default judgment. A default judgment can be entered if the party or its attorney doesn't appear in the court of law. Now, he shows us that he is in line with the other side, with the defendant. He then kicks me out of the courtroom so that there's no legal representation for my client, and then he tells the other side, move for a default judgment, which he then enters. I mean, this is not the end of the story, but it shows you exactly in what kind of shape our judiciary system is. It is a it is a smoking pile of rubbish, and it has been for years. This is not just because of Corona. Our court system is completely bankrupt. There's so much corruption going on.
Dziękuję panie doktorze za wyczerpujące...
Thank you very much for this exhaustive answer. We will now start the last round of questions, and I beg you to keep it short, to be able to ask and answer questions quite quickly, because we don't have that much time left. So, Attorney Jacek Wilk, thank you. We already know that the entire panic and fear spiral was caused by the PCR tests. And on the basis of this panic, the governments introduced unproportionally stringent restrictions that limited citizen rights. However, the most hot issue right now is the problem of the medical experiment. In Poland, the situation is like this. We all know that the vaccines actually skipped certain phases of research. We don't exactly know how many doses are needed, what are the combinations of those doses. So it looks like a huge experiment, medical experiment. However, the people who get vaccinated do not sign a form of consent, of informed consent. There is no such form before the vaccination. What is more, many people are forced to take part in the experiment through pressure, through sanitary segregation, through limiting the rights of the unvaccinated population, which is a clear discrimination. So my question is, in Germany and in other countries, do you also notice this kind of pressure of forcing people to take part in this medical experiment? And what do your lawyers think? Because many lawyers in Poland feel paralyzed and overwhelmed by this situation. However, some of them are brave enough to call it a medical experiment. So how does it look like from your point of view? Have you had any court decisions or eminent lawyers confirming that this is a medical experiment and that you have no right, nobody could or should force anyone to get vaccinated by discrimination, by sanitary segregation, by limiting the rights of the unvaccinated population? Thank you.
Proszę, Dr. Reiner Füllmich.
We have the same problems in Germany. This is a global problem. People are being pressured by their employers, public employers or private employers, to get vaccinated or else they're going to lose their jobs. This is completely, totally illegal. It is unconstitutional because we're not talking about real vaccines. We're talking about untested things that don't have full approval yet. In Europe, it is the conditional approval. In the United States, it's called emergency use approval. Emergency use approval. And there's no way that you can force anyone to take a vaccine that doesn't even have full approval. On top of this, there cannot be mandatory vaccinations. We have a new expert opinion by one of the best constitutional lawyers in our country. Professor Mirosław is his name. And he explicitly states in great detail how it is totally, completely, utterly unthinkable and totally unconstitutional to force people to take a product which is not even a vaccine, but rather an experimental gene therapy. However, as we know, the courts of law can decide whatever they want. It's the government, for example, in Austria when they had their PCR test decision, or in Portugal when they had their PCR test decision. It's the government that should listen to what they're being told by the courts, because in theory, at least, we have a separation of powers. But in practice, we don't anymore. We have someone who thinks she's an emperor and who can run the country. Same is probably true in most other countries as well. So what ultimately it all boils down to, yes, we have to go and file more and more complaints. We have to go and make use of the courts. We will ultimately I think, have to do, it's the people. It's the people who have to rise up and tell these dictators and these, to stop this tyranny. We're not going to play along anymore. And we can only get the people to do this if they get all the information that they need. Of course, it is totally illegal to force someone to get a vaccine. Why is it illegal? Because if you consent has to be voluntary. But if you threaten you're going to lose your job if you don't consent, this is not voluntary anymore. This is battery. This is murder if it goes wrong. And in many cases, it does go wrong.
But we now have also the first cases of victims of vaccination damages sue the doctors that performed the vaccination on them, because the consent, we do have a consent form, but it's like insufficient because it's not pointing to the the limited admission to the market of this vaccine, and also the experimental character that it has. And so we had in our committee, we heard a lady who unfortunately after the vaccination developed a thrombosis and lost, 3 meters of her small intestines, only has like 50 centimeters left, so she's going to be disabled. It's a young lady, like 30 years old, for the rest of her life, basically not going to be able to work anymore. And now she sued the doctor. And these cases, if we have them, we're also accumulating now information about people with these kind of damages and making it visible and public, and also encouraging them to go after the doctors in order to make it less attractive for them, or even like, shy away from continuing with the money-making vaccine game that they're all playing, so that they develop some sort of awareness of what they're doing and how dangerous it can be.
Tutaj minutka przerwy dla pana doktora.
Okay, so we'll have 1 minute break. So let's wait a second. Let me use this break
Tak. Jesteśmy umówieni.
all things that were said by a doctor about Mr. Global, the anonymous unidentified Mr. Global, even if it hadn't been for the fact that our meeting is not a free discussion in the internet, it would be much easier to boil it down to one denominator as a madman conspiracy theory, but we are in the group of politicians and lawyers. And we have a lawyer speaking with great experience and a practitioner as well. So my appeal to the audience and to the analysts of our meeting is please don't stay complacent with all that you've heard. As Doctor said, if there are no factual basis, there are no legal basis as well, and this is the fundamental takeaway from this meeting. So also for that reason, our research on the actual state of things makes sense, because they can lead us to the deeming the illegality of all that. And their attorney summed up it all, saying that it's not medical, it's political. And I think that is also a fundamental takeaway and a message that the medical status and the medical conditions can be under discussion and can be controversial, but it's not on us. And it's not our obligation to determine that. So if there is anything controversial in this matter, it has no legal basis. So decision made by the government or by the judicial system or by the politicians or by the legislators. So if there is any shade of doubt, this doubt should be to our benefit. It's not our problem, and it's not our matter to explain our controversies. It's not our obligation to indicate the perpetrator, to catch somebody by the hand, the mysterious Mr. Global. It's not our task to identify them. This is the government's responsibility, that there are no signatures on these agreements and that Mr. Global is not identified yet. So it's not our obligation to carry out investigation in order to explain all controversies, but we can ask that if there are no explanations, we should make the government accountable for that. And so the issue of agreements, for sure, we will focus on that. And now let me refer to Professor Piotrowski. Ultimately, we need to finalize this matter, so to decide who is under which jurisdiction and whether the agreements were made or not, in fact. And another important sentence that was said: money is not the final goal, this is just a tool. And this is very important and very interesting, because we could be misled by thinking that money plays the most important role, that they just follow the money. So following the money will not allow us to conclude on this matter. And just the last sentence to point out and to draw your attention to, which is quite shocking, seemingly shocking. Ultimately, we will have to establish our own judicial system in order to settle all these matters. This sentence might be quite shocking, but we need to be courageous, because the Nuremberg trials, they were not established in the binding law on the territory of Germany in the 30s and 40s. And finally, these trials were carried out. Leaving aside controversies around these proceedings, we assign some meaning and we attach some meaning to them. But there were some proceedings against medical doctors, and the aim of them was to put an end to this practice of medical experiments. So this is the Nuremberg heritage that we will refer to in the future. So I use the opportunity to sum up, but please continue. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking the floor. And now I would like to ask and to refer to Professor Mirosław Piotrowski, and I suggest to stick to your time limit, because we need to discuss all topics. So thank you very much. Dr. Reiner Füllmich in one of his presentations, his discussions with regard to the medical council, he said that these are murderers and perpetrators and that should be ashamed. This is how dear doctor said that. And we had such medical council in Poland as well that adopts resolutions and issues directives and supports the Prime Minister and the members of this medical council. They issue leaflets also in my town, which are distributed at schools, and pupils are encouraged to get vaccinated, and members of this medical board, and I have the official version of this leaflet, the vaccination is not a medical experiment, and they said as an example, Pfizer that came through the third phase of clinical trials, and they operate in a so-called gray zone, and AstraZeneca, for example, that supplemented its specification in March this year, had to say that after injections there were some deaths recorded. But people with a medical title with medical title say that this is not a medical experiment, and the producers in the specifications of this products, and 4 of them, they say and that trials and tests are not completed, so that they cannot state how long does the protection lasts, because it's because the trials are underway. And on the other hand, we have a doctor employed in the hospital and who states on an official leaflet directed to children that this is not a medical experiment, that it was accepted for trading in Europe, but European Europe, the third phase, it takes at least 10 years. And there are some information that this is the fact. So how can we protect ourselves in a legal sense? As C19 group workers, we're very glad about the cooperation, our prospect cooperation with Dr. Füllmich, and we count on your suggestion and on your helpful hand, and attorney Vivian Fischer. So please comment on that. The situation where we are and where our pupils and parents are, because, for example, when parents ask head teachers for any recommendation from the, for example, sanitary inspectorate. The sanitary inspectorate doesn't exist in Poland, in fact, for a year. So, thank you, dear professor. Now, Dr. Füllmich, please refer to this question and all topics referred to.
Yeah, well, they are claiming that this is not an experimental drug, but that's a lie. Because it's obvious that's an experimental drug, because the trials, as they themselves admit, have not even been completed yet. I think both Moderna and BioNTech Pfizer, these trials shall be completed in 2022 or 2023. So how can this not be an experimental drug if the trials haven't even been completed? In addition to that, as far as BioNTech Pfizer is concerned, we just learned from, I think, one of the people who is involved in the nullification complaints that, I think it was Dr. Holzeisen herself who told us this, that some of the medical data that BioNTech Pfizer gave to the European Commission, to the EMA, European Medical Agency, in order to get approval for their drug, conditional approval, are from completely different trials. Completely different trials. Not from the trials that they should have performed with these anti-corona vaccines, but from completely different trials. So there is very concrete evidence that they lied to the European Commission or to EMA in order to get this conditional approval. This is even worse than not being told that this is an experimental drug. It's probably, it will probably eventually turn out that none of these vaccines, in particular not BioNTech Pfizer, is effective at all. They claim it's 95% effective. In the beginning, they said it's 100% effective, and then they went down to 95%. But that's because they're playing around with the numbers. If you look at it from what they call a relative risk reduction, then maybe you can come to the conclusion that it's 95% effective. But if you look closer, then you find out that you have to vaccinate 145, I think, people in order to save one person or immunize them. In the meantime, we know there is no immunization, which is at the core of any vaccine. But there is no immunization. But if you look at how many people you have to expose to the risk of these untested vaccines, 145, until finally someone is immunized, which he's not, then the relative risk reduction is less than 1%. And we know from what we're seeing in Israel that it is totally, completely ineffective. Because 86% of the people who are hospitalized with COVID symptoms that they must have gotten through the vaccination, these people have been twice vaccinated. So it tells you the whole story. I think the most important thing is for all of us to connect. We have to connect with all of the other Eastern European people. Not the governments, but the people. The Western European people. The United States, Canada, they're in really bad shape in Canada and in Australia. You've probably seen this on television. They're coming down very hard on them. And that's because, hearkening back to the question that you posed about the class action in Canada. That class action in Canada is not just suing the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're also suing the Catholic Church and the House of Windsor. Because, as we now know, there is a reason for these former or still Commonwealth countries to suffer as badly as they are. Because this is a Commonwealth country, Canada and Australia. So we have to connect with these people so that we can help each other, and we also, I think, have to bring out all of this information so that as many people as possible understand what's going on. Unfortunately, I think it'll take a dramatic turn to the worse before it gets better. Mm-hmm.
Dziękuję serdecznie, panie doktorze.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now I would like to give the floor to attorney Krzysztof Łopatowski. I have been listening to you with attention, to Doctor and to attorney, and my question will refer, I changed it slightly, it will refer to an uncomfortable situation for me. So, have you seen in your countries a situation when you, as people, as human beings who oppose the evidence-based medicine, who ignore scientific data, are you called anti-vaxxers? Are you called words? Are you called stupid? Are you called mentally ill? How do you cope with that? Because this is a big and a difficult problem in Poland. It might seem and sound even funny, but it's not funny at all. The court practice, the judiciary practice that we can observe, it goes very much rooted in the mainstream. So how do you see this? Doctor, now I give you the floor. Please answer.
Yes, indeed. All of us, doctors, lawyers, economists, anyone who comes out and who is not in line with the government, again, it's not our government, I don't think. Anyone who is not in line with the official line is being called names. Some of them call us anti-vaxxers, but most of us are called right-wing Nazi. Those are the two things that all of us are being called. I haven't even gone to the polling booth for the last 8 years because I thought, politics is totally corrupt. I'm going to live my own life. I don't care. That was a mistake. Because while myself and many others who felt the same way, who were totally disgusted with our mainstream politics, looked away. They were setting up all these puppets. They were installing all of these puppets in all of the, what they think, strategically important positions. That's the only reason why now it's so hard for us to turn the tide. They installed their puppets in politics, in the media, in the courts of law. The president of our constitutional court is one of them. We should have been more careful. How do I react to that? I don't care, because I know that many people who listen to this, to these personal attacks, understand, more and more people understand, if they have to attack us on a personal level, they cannot attack us on the merits, because they don't have any arguments. This is what many people understand, because this has been going on for too long. Too many people all of a sudden are right-wing Nazi. I used to vote, when I did go to the polling booths, I used to vote for the Social Democrats, even for the Green Party, which I now think is a huge mistake. A huge mistake. But not having done anything and not having gone to the voting, to the polling booths for at least 8 years, that was another huge mistake. But it is never too late. We're gonna have to do in this cooperation of you and us and all of the others, we're gonna turn this thing around by bringing the truth out, because that is always, I have one hero, one legal hero, not a German lawyer or judge. He's an American judge. He lived about 100 years ago. His name is Justice Brandeis, Louis D. Brandeis. 100 years ago, he did what we are doing now, because even then, things were pretty dire, because there were so many very corrupt large corporations who decided that they don't care if people die as long as they make money. Back then, it was the financial industry. It still is, by the way. It is the financial industry which is behind all of this, investing in the pharmaceutical and the tech industry. It was the financial industry and the oil industry, the Rockefellers and these people. And there's one thing he said, and this one thing is really important for all of us. Sunlight is the best of disinfectants. You have to shine a light into these dark corners to make people understand what is really going on. That will turn the tide. And then it's our new legal system which will do the cleanup work. But to stop this, we need to get the people to rise up, and this is important. We have to give them all the information that we have.
Bardzo dziękuję. Teraz pan...
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to attorney Jarosław Litwin.
To treat the patients with therapies based on their own experience, using known and cheap drugs and supplements which are effective. And you mentioned, for example, ivermectin.
As far as I know, there have not been any problems for these doctors who advise their patients to use alternative methods of treatment. As far as I know, I don't know if you see this differently, but there's a vitamin D, vitamin C is available. I'm not sure if ivermectin is on a broad scale available, but people know about it. So if a patient comes to see a doctor and tells them, listen, I have heard from credible sources that ivermectin is something that works as an alternative treatment, I don't think that this patient or the doctor who then prescribes ivermectin will have a problem. It is not on that level that people experience difficulties, but I'm not sure. Maybe she has, maybe Viviane has more detailed information.
No, it is like what Reiner Füllmich says. There's so far has not been any problem, and but what you should look at if you have this kind of problem here, that maybe there are restrictions for the doctors. In Italy, we had a similar situation where there was a very strict protocol on how to treat the patients, and actually it turned out to be like completely flawful. Like using a huge amount of hydroxychloroquine and all this. And actually in Italy, I think the district attorney is now looking at the governmental entity that issued this kind of proceedings, how to treat the patients on a criminal basis, because the victims or the relatives of the deceased had sued the government. So it's an interesting kind of approach if this is the case here. But it's also very interesting to see that a lot of it seems orchestrated, like at least looking at it, because it's the same kind of protocols that came out in a lot of countries at the same time, pushing the same kind of treatment that medically didn't make any sense. And we have, for instance, also on the social engineering part with creating fear in the government. We have seen in several countries also the same kind of strategies. And in Germany, even a paper leaked from the Ministry of the Interior, called the panic paper, later called the panic paper, where they actually came up with this kind of story that was supposed to be told, that if you as a child meet with your grandmother and then she's going to be, she dies this horrible death of suffocation because she cannot breathe, because she contracted corona, that this was this kind of image that was supposed to be pushed onto the population. So that's very strange that you have these kind of seemingly strategic elements. Of course, I also get the feeling that there's a very strategic element of it, behind it, but it's on some points we cannot yet prove it, but at least it seems to be some kind of system that has gone out of control, that's either been pushed forward with strategic element that can come out, or I don't know, then taken over by people who are themselves driven by enormous fear, or have other interests in their minds. It's very strange, but you should also look, and it would be interesting to also cooperate with you on this kind of this in this area, if you have also these kind of points of where things turn into a different direction.
Thank you for this answer, because I asked this question we have some problems with doctors who prescribe medications which are antiviral, and they appear to work with treating this disease. Nevertheless, they are, as far as I am concerned, persecuted by medical councils. So I was just curious how the situation looks like in Germany. So thank you very much for your answer.
Let me add something. Thus far, we haven't seen any pressure on doctors in Germany prescribing alternative methods of treatment. We think that the other side is probably believing that this is not necessary, because they are circumventing doctors' opposition to these vaccinations by, instead of what happened during the swine flu, it was still the family doctors who had to perform the injections in their own offices, in their practices. They circumvented this by inventing these vaccination centers. And that's why they think they don't have to worry about anything. But in the United States, it's a little bit different, because we've learned now from Robert F. Kennedy, who was a couple of weeks ago, he introduced his new book on Dr. Fauci, who is a criminal, and this is being said by someone who is a lawyer, who knows that the facts that he's seeing should be and can only be analyzed in such a way as to result in the finding that Fauci is a criminal. Fauci mandated a certain method of treatment before the introduction of the so-called vaccines. He mandated that everyone be treated with a drug called remdesivir, knowing, because he had participated in prior trials, that this is deadly. 25% of the people, I think there was an anti-Ebola trial in which they tested different drugs. One of them was remdesivir. It killed 25% of the people. That's a lot. And all of a sudden he comes out and he prescribes this. He mandates that the doctors in the United States, in particular in New York, use remdesivir. That explains many of the people who died. Or the prescription of high dosages of hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine seems to work if you don't overdose it, but if you prescribe high dosages, then it can be really dangerous. Also, you have to take into consideration that in New York, a large percentage of the population is black or Latino, and they have a special genetic disposition which is called favism. I think 20 or 30% of the black and the Latino population has this special genetic condition. And if they get hydroxychloroquine, it kills them. So that's why I'm saying, this is a really good question. If you mandate certain methods of treatment, you have to really know what you're doing. I think Dr. Fauci knew exactly what he was doing. That's why Bobby Kennedy calls him a criminal, a murderer. And I agree with that. We have not had that problem yet in Germany, but it may come to that because things are getting worse before it's going to get better.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie doktorze. I ostatnie
Thank you very
pytanie.
much, doctor. The last question for today, attorney Arkadiusz Tetela. I have more than one question, but ask one, please. Before I start, I want to explain that when I was asking about the International Court of Justice in The Hague, I was not speaking about the criminal matters, but rather the governments, because free flow of people is one of the rights of the European Union, so every citizen who has seen that their right is limited can file a complaint, and they can be supported by the member states. We know that the COVID passports don't work because actually people can be infected anyway, even if they have the passport. So before the courts start working without fear to give unpopular decisions against the mainstream narrative, maybe we could try this path in The Hague. So that's why I asked about this Court of Justice and not the criminal court. As to the Polish law, medical interventions can only be done on the basis of informed consent. So informed consent is necessary. The manufacturers of medical devices inform in their leaflets that they did not test if it's carcinogenic. There was no long-term trial. They don't know anything about interactions with different kinds of medications that the people are taking. So have you considered, or have you already maybe filed a suit that those vaccinations were done actually without any informed consent? I don't know how the German legal framework looks, and if you had any lawsuit of this kind, I would like to know the results. As to civic liability, we are getting reports every day of important heavy adverse events after vaccinations. And in Poland, there is no mechanism to give compensation to those people. So we required to know the contracts between Poland and European Commission, and nobody sent us those contracts, although it's required by law. So compensation can be obtained from the manufacturers, so that's why we wanted to analyze the contracts. So were you able to gain access to the contracts between the German government and European Commission, or directly between the German government and the manufacturers of those vaccines? And are there actually indemnization clauses for those manufacturers, and on what basis?
Thank you very much, dear doctor. Please respond to the question.
I'll start with the last question, the contracts. As far as the European Union is concerned, there's only one contract between the European Union and the manufacturers. There are no individual contracts with each of the member states. There are only powers of attorney that were given by the member states to the European Union. There are lots of holes in this story. We're trying to get a closer look at this because this friend of ours, who is also an attorney who I mentioned earlier, he's the one who found out that there's no signatures on these contracts or on these, I'm going to have to ask him again, but it looks as though there are no signatures on the powers of attorney either. And also, this is a preliminary finding, it is not a final finding yet, but he has also found that the basis of the powers of attorney is a reference to a law which doesn't exist. It's a section, I forget what law it is, the act of something. It's a section which they refer to with a subsection which doesn't exist. So there are so many holes in this story that I think that there's not even a contractual basis. If nobody signs the contracts or the powers of attorney, there cannot be a contractual basis. So that's the answer to that question. The informed consent question, well, this is a real problem because as far as I know, most of the people in Germany, and as I'm hearing from you, most of the people here in this country never got any real information. Because real information includes, of course, the information on all the side effects that have been shown up in the meantime. You have to tell people that this is possible, this can happen, and doesn't just happen in isolated incidents. It happens all the time. Myocarditis, for example, happens to a lot of young men. I don't know if any of you remember the scene of this Danish soccer player who collapsed on the playing field, and the only reason why he was saved is because there were all these specialists on the sidelines that helped him. But he's never, ever going to be able to play again, because some of the human organs do not, most of our body fixes itself, but the heart, the brain, the spine, and the lungs, and there's one other organ, if it is damaged, it is damaged permanently. So this case of myocarditis, which we think this soccer player suffered from, I know that he was vaccinated because one of my neighbors happens to be from Denmark and he knows this guy. So this whole team was vaccinated. Myocarditis struck him down, his life was saved, but his heart will never work 100% safely again. So these are the things that people who get vaccinations, who get the shots rather, must be informed about, because you cannot make an informed decision, you cannot give your informed consent unless you have the real information. The other thing is, of course, that they all have to know about the fact that this is an experimental drug, because it's still in the trial stages. As far as the International Court of Law, I thought that you were referring to the criminal court, but maybe you're referring to the Human Rights Court. The Human Rights Court may be a different story. We still think that there may be difficulties because it is easier for the other side to infiltrate the international courts than it is to go directly into the national courts. I know that in Germany, with respect, for example, to the example I just gave about the president of the Constitutional Court, he's one of their puppets. But it is much easier, at least that's what we hear, it is much easier to infiltrate the international courts. That's why they're saying that 25%, roughly, nobody knows the exact number, but roughly 25% of the people who became judges with the International Human Rights Court or the European Human Rights Court or the International Criminal Courts were financed by money from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and George Soros. His Open Society, I think, is what it's called.
Serdecznie dziękujemy.
Thank you very much for having you and for staying with us, dear guests, dear audience. Now, the final note by Grzegorz Braun. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of issues and limited resources. As long as we act as a grassroots activity and as it's not our full-time job, the time has come to act in a systematic way and to take it to a higher political and legal level. I have a question to all of you. The first one and the last one on my side. What concrete legal activities are, according to you, the most fruitful and which bring the widest perspective? So establishment of the perpetrator of responsibility and holding accountable in front of courts. So which concrete actions? What should be our area of focus? What should we concentrate on in our work? Maybe one point of historical reference, because maybe it is not possible with Mr. Global as Al Capone to convict him for his most serious crimes, but maybe we can put him to jail for tax offenses. So what to do and how to proceed to stop Mr. Global being the king of our life and our governor, to stop Mr. Global and to prevent him from finalizing his operation and to lead to our gloomy end. The more concrete will be your answer, the more grateful I will be for it.
Is no more dangerous than the flu, and two, the PCR test is trying to make it look as though it's more dangerous, because through the PCR test, which is totally and completely incapable of detecting any infections, through the setup of this PCR test, it looks as though they're cases, when in reality, they're all false positive test results. And I think we're in the process of helping our colleagues in South Africa to file a big lawsuit. It is going to be filed with their constitutional court. In Germany, we can't do this. We have to go through the trial courts, and then eventually we can appeal to the constitutional court. But in South Africa, this is possible. You can file a complaint with their highest court, and even though South Africa is supposedly a very corrupt country, our colleagues in South Africa are telling us that court is totally independent. It has real judges who will really follow the evidence. And we have helped them with a number of experts who have testified before our Corona Committee, with Mike Yeadon, Professor Kemmerer, who's our German specialist on PCR tests, Catherine Austin Fitz, who explains about the economic fallout of all of this, and Wolfgang Wodak, Susharit Bhakti, Professor Bhakti. They are about to file this complaint. I know that they wanted to go into the details of proportionality, but I did manage to talk them out of this, because I said, go for the foundation.
Go for the basis of this. You don't have to talk about proportionality if there is no basis for this. Go after the PCR test. And that's why they're fighting us so hard in the German courts of law. That's why they're trying to not even engage into a discussion about the merits of the case. That's why they wanted me to wear a mask when I don't have to wear a mask. This is, that's where it hurts them the most. They know if ever this goes into a hearing of the experts, they cannot win this. That's why I think that's the most important thing. And finally, I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Tetela, that we do have to go to an international court, but it should be one that we create. We are the people. We are the people. If we decide we want this setup of a court, then they have to follow. They're just, 300 very super rich families who run everything. We're billions of people. If we decide we want an international court, and that's what we're working on, towards the end of the year, we're going to have, we will have an international Corona tribunal. It will sort of be like the Nuremberg trials. It's just that the Nuremberg trials happened after the war was over, and we're doing this while the war is still going on.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wrap-up. I'd like to thank all of you and Attorney Tetela, dear Doctor, dear Grzegorz Braun. Before Nuremberg, there were millions of victims, and we do not have time. An international tribunal and international courts are as they are, and the evidence collected by now are very speak for themselves on of material nature. So even if it will be a decision that is not based on collected evidence, somebody will have to put their signature below. So using the tools that we consider as possible to be used today, no matter whether are concerns and doubts when it comes to the verdict, I think that they are just necessary. Absolutely. Let me comment that this is a practical discussion between two lawyers, and that was my dream to see such discussion when I initiated this event and this meeting. So hopefully the works, not academic discussion, but real works will be continued. Once again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and for sharing such a comprehensive and important evidence, for providing us with this evidence, and thank you very much in advance for sharing all documents and for any further suggestions and any further guidelines. Let me wrap up this hearing of the Parliamentary Committee, and let me remind you that still 2 meetings ahead of us, an expert group meeting that will be held with medical doctors, researchers, and members of academia who will come from different corners of Poland to visit us in Warsaw. This meeting will be moderated by Professor Ryszard Zajączkowski, and during this expert meeting we will present our declaration, our Warsaw Declaration, the document that we named in this way, and hopefully it will be signed over there. And in the evening, we will have an open meeting for the public together with you. And we will continue. Of course, we will discuss this meeting separately. There are some matters that emerged. Some names were called today. These were names of people, and we'll try to invite all these people to Warsaw for next meetings. The meeting of our Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry, acting as a parliamentary group for the purpose of breaches and infringements with regard to COVID-19. So this hearing is hereby closed. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank to all members, all audience and the technical team and the interpreters and people who provided for the broadcast. So God bless you and see you soon.